With Stranger Things, the Duffer Brothers have created a new series that throws back to some of the classic horror from the 80s and the 90s. Shows like Twin Peaks and The X-Files, they came along and they changed the game, and they inspired a generation of writers and filmmakers. So what makes a good horror film? And how the hell do you scare people?
Horror, the challenge is to keep the suspense across multiple episodes in such a way that the audience wants to keep coming back for the next episode. So you need to have the good cliffhangers at the end of each episode. And then you also need to have, I guess, an overarching plot that's also quite intense and quite frightening.
Absolutely. And so if you were to cast your mind back to sort of the 80s and 90s period of horror with the two staple shows being X-Files and Twin Peaks, what comes to mind when you think of those shows in terms of the techniques that they used to snag an audience?
Yeah, so in terms of narrative, what was always so great about them was that at the end of every single episode, you wanted to come back for the next one because you weren't sure what is going to happen next. You just had absolutely no idea. And you knew that the characters were in a situation which is likely to be very dangerous, but you weren't sure how they'd be able to get through that.
These shows came at a turning point as well, and they created a whole new form of television which in popular culture became phenomenal. What do you think contributed to the way those shows affected the zeitgeist of general pop culture at the time?
Yeah, so I guess at that point in time, television was a very distinct kind of media, and it had its own set of rules compared to other, forms of entertainment. And what those shows did was they brought a really cinematic approach to how people could consume television, how they would watch it, and how it was made. So I think that not just bringing in quality actors and not just about writing across a decent script and working with much higher production values. It was also the feel, the atmosphere was very cinematic, and I think for the time that was quite boundary pushing.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and I think too with like the X-Files in particular, it provided a conversation point because all these tales of the unexpected and the science fiction elements of conspiracy theories and whatnot. It meant you could go to work the next day around the water cooler or whatever and just discuss these things. And I think the conversation that surrounded the X-Files and Twin Peaks, you had the mystery of who killed Laura Palmer. They just provided conversation more than most other shows ever would at the time.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Before the internet and before social media, it was the water cooler conversations or the conversations that you'd have with your family where you would share information. So the conversations that you'd have would be very inclusive with all your co-workers and your family members. And that really drove the success of these shows because it caused people to go and watch it, even on the recommendation of their friends.
What would you say are some of the influences of, let's stick with the X-Files and Twin Peaks, what influenced those shows, do you think? I mean, they changed the game, but where did their influence lie?
Yeah, I think they're kind of an extension of the American Gothic kind of genre or approach to horror, in that there's a natural environment, and then there's always some kind of other that kind of comes in and impacts on that environment. And then the focus of the story is looking at how the population deal with that other force.
The X-Files was essentially like Kolchak, but with a lot of the hokiness removed. And Scully was a progression of the Clarice Starling role from Silence of the Lambs. I think that was a big major influence as well. And it's just interesting how one thing affects another, and the X-Files and Twin Peaks went on to completely inspire decades worth of content, including Stranger Things, this new series.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really fascinating that you can go back to these shows even today and watch them and they still feel very modern precisely because they have informed so much of the conversation in how we create television, especially horror, obviously, since that day.
Stranger Things is this new series from the Duffer Brothers. What's your immediate response to this show?
Well, I thought it was a brilliant throwback to the everything about the 80s that I grew up with and love. I felt that it played very heavily on nostalgia and in a good way. It used it to kind of inform its own storyline. And from that opening moment of the pilot where the kids are there playing Dungeons and Dragons, that was me back in the 80s, rolling dice and playing those kind of fantasy games. And you don't really have a more iconic symbol of the 80s than a bunch of kids coming together to play, Dungeons and Dragons on a Sunday night.
Well, that's it. I completely fanboyed over this one. It usually takes me 1 or 2 episodes to really get stuck into a show. This one had me right from the get-go. I think from the intro with the electro synthy pop score, the title card very reminiscent of maybe Stephen King and things like that, and then of course the kids on bikes. That immediately took me back to my childhood. I was a kid again watching this, and I think that's one of the strengths of the show too. Is it is a horror show and it's a mystery, but I think there's an appeal for generations here. You got the kids will get into it from the adventure point of view. The adults that were kids in the 80s can really get stuck into it because it just takes them right back to their own childhood.
One of the strengths of the show is the fact it goes beyond just the horror genre. It's also a drama, it's also a mystery, and it's an example, again, of the American Gothic tradition, but in a broader sense. It's not just about frightening people, it's also about, the impacts of what's going on families, on community. It's about the characters, it's about the adventure, the sense of adventure, it's about the mystery. So it's all of those things, and each episode will tap into parts of that, and everybody will kind of pull something out of it based on what they've watched.
I'm interested to see how dark it gets.
It will become its own show. It's using these nostalgic references to get people in, and that's a great thing, because there are a lot of people that are nostalgic for the 80s. But it will then move on to become its own beast. And I think that's going to be an interesting journey to watch.
I'm sure you're like me, you can't wait to see where this show's going, and you're just as giddy as a schoolboy.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much.